I think I found it. The worst bus rapid transit system in the world. I say that confidently since I know I'm defended by the subjectivity of that statement, but I think I can convince you too in this video. I took a field visit to see this disaster for myself, and today I want to talk about it. What is it? Why do I think it's so bad? And what exactly went wrong, and how can we fix it to make sure that it never happens again? Welcome to Transit World, videos on all things transportation, with a focus on the developing world. Tijuana. If you live outside of North America, it's likely you've maybe never heard of Tijuana, or just consider it some dot on the map. If you live in the US, you might think of Tijuana as a place for college kids and drugs and human trafficking. And if you live in Mexico, well, you might think those things too, but you probably also recognize that it's a legitimate global city. It has a large, growing population with an even larger economic contribution, not just for Mexico, but to industries throughout North America and really throughout the world. But despite its rapid expansion and 1 million daily transit users, which by the way is more than many big cities, especially in the US, Tijuana doesn't get its due representation in international development discussions. But I certainly think it's a city that's worth talking about. And they have a piece of infrastructure that I think very much is worth talking about. Their bus rapid transit system, known as SITT. So we're going to divide this video into three major parts. The first is just what is the system. Second is my firsthand evaluation of the system as it stands right now. And the third is exactly what went wrong and evaluating kind of what's next and how to fix this. So let's jump in. Tijuana started as a classic story of a city that wanted to build BRT in an attempt to overhaul their public transit system. Tijuana's public transit system historically has been made up of predominantly informal transit services, which bring all of these classic externalities. The system experiences what's called sometimes the war of the penny, where transit becomes hyper-competitive and with really low margins as everybody's competing against each other, which leads to vehicles being really old and uncomfortable, drivers being aggressive in a quest to really just pick up as many fares as possible. And the existing transit in Tijuana actually is pretty expensive too. The average fare is around 75 cents, which is high, but okay. But there's no free transfers, and as many as 50% of riders have to make 2 or more transfers to reach their destinations. So in those cases, they're often paying more than the transit fare in many US cities. There had been a lot of attempts to reform public transit, but in 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto promised to build what is now the SITT system, and once he won the presidency, the system was set up and constructed by local officials of the same party over the next few years. SITT promised all of the kind of classic textbook elements that you get when you're trying to convert informal transit through a BRT system. First of all, it tried to organize all of the transit with a trunk route that connected to feeder routes with integrated station stops and transfer experiences. It also brought with it an integrated fare system, promised a smart card payment, free transfers, and easy to obtain discounts for students, elderly, people with disabilities, etc. SITT also boasted broader system improvements, such as increased accessibility for people with disabilities, and all of the bells and whistles in the stations, such as Wi-Fi and bathrooms and improved shelters from the elements. It also offered broader infrastructure investments, such as a vehicle bridge linking the border area to downtown, 8 new pedestrian bridges and the rebuilding of 7 others, and the installation of over 40 new traffic signals, new fiber optic lines, resurfacing some of the roadways, etc. SITT was set up as a semi-autonomous municipal agency charged with creating and running the BRT system, but it was also formed through a partnership with the so-called Company of Companies, which represented the 10 existing informal transit concessionaires that would together be operating and funding the new buses. For the funding of the infrastructure, that came predominantly through the federal government as well as some city resources. There was also some money from the World Bank. It was estimated by SITT at the time that the project was the biggest infrastructure investment since the namesake river had been channelized in the 1970s. So this was a big project in Tijuana. Okay, so let's take a look at the system as it is right now. I'm going to be evaluating the system, again based as I've done in other videos, on the framework outlined by Jarrett Walker, but being kind of lazy here, so I'm going to bundle together a bit into 5 ultimate categories that I actually do think represent pretty well the important elements of transit service. For each of these elements, I'll be assigning a letter grade, A through F. So let's start with coverage, and I'm actually starting on a pretty positive note. I'm giving coverage a B, which, as you'll see in a minute, is the highest grade that any of these categories are going to receive. It really does have pretty good coverage, given that it's only one line. At its southern terminus in Insurgentes, it connects many working class neighborhoods along the beautiful Tijuana River, which, all kidding aside, is one of the busiest and most important travel corridors in Tijuana through the Avenida Via Rápida, which is also a continuation of I-5, which connects through San Diego. The system stops at the intercity bus terminal. It goes through Plaza Rio, which is the cosmopolitan center of the city with dense retail and office developments. It goes right through the heart of actual downtown, which is the densest development in the metro area, and connects with the San Isidro border crossing, which is the busiest border crossing in the Western world. So ostensibly, the system does connect with the San Diego trolley, which is just on the other side of the border. And there is a tremendous amount of overlap with the informal transit and colectivo lines, especially in the downtown area, but there's no coordination at all between transfer fares or schedules. There's no shared stops, at least they're not supposed to. So I can't really give this a full grade on the connectivity scale. And now we move to frequency and span, which I'm gonna give an F. Actually, no, let's do an F minus, and even that I don't think does justice. You see, I was really excited to do this site visit, and I wanted to see the BRT as much as possible in person. So I found a cafe right on the main street in downtown, and I paid for an overpriced coffee, so I had a good excuse to sit in their outdoor seating with a front row seat to see all of the action. I was ready to film, and I wanted to check out for myself the headways, the passenger volumes, the variety of buses that SITT was running with that day. What better way to spend my day off? But 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30, then an entire hour, and I didn't see a single bus. I also didn't see any passengers waiting at the main downtown station. So I decided I had to confirm online that the system was actually still running. And that's when I realized that, according to their website, they were operating with 45-minute headways. I eventually ran out of coffee, despite my ridiculously slow sipping, and I gave up after waiting a bit over an hour. But as I was leaving, I finally saw a single bus. And by the way, despite what the website says, I was able to confirm later through driver and passenger interviews that the bus only comes once per hour, at least on the weekends. This is just ridiculously infrequent for a bus rapid transit system. I can't stress this enough. Here are things that I saw more frequently than the BRT system going through downtown. Colectivos. Saw a lot more colectivos, going all sorts of different directions. The long distance bus to Tecate. Police vehicles. And donkeys painted like zebras. Really shameful. The span also wasn't that great, but it was completely overshadowed by how bad the frequency was. And honestly, I think frequency in itself is enough to make this the worst BRT system in the world. All right, let's return to something that was slightly better, travel time. I'm going to give this a C. The BRT system does have a dedicated right-of-way for much of the route in and near downtown, especially in the Plaza Rio area. And the right-of-way was actually respected, at least the Sunday that I was there, despite reports to the contrary and an official decision to allow general purpose vehicles to use the lanes. Apparently the government decided that a bus line with 30 to 60 minute headways and terrible ridership wasn't worth its own lane, at least not for the moment. More on this later. Other streets did have a right-of-way, but it was quite spotty, and it was just near the stations or with treatments that didn't really make it super clear that it actually was a bus-only lane. And there was no right-of-way at all on the main freeway that follows the Tijuana River, which is the majority of the corridor mileage. So how was travel time? Well, there's only so much I can say since I did a one-day site visit, but for what it's worth, I did take 2 trips, and my travel times were, yes, a little worse than driving, even with moderate traffic, but not by a crazy amount. Moving on to fare. I'm going to give this one an F, although, to be honest, I got pretty close to almost giving them a D, so congratulations. A one-way ticket is priced at 14 pesos, about 75 cents, which is about the same as most of the colectivo services, maybe a few pesos cheaper than some of the longer distance ones. SITT does honor discounted prices for elderly and students and disabled, etc., that the colectivos are also supposed to provide, but often are actually not given by those drivers since they have much more of a need to turn a profit on the fare. So maybe I'll give a small point here in favor of SITT since they better honor the discounts that everybody's supposed to follow. But there's no integrated fare system or card, despite the promises that were provided when the system opened. And you have to pay exact cash only with coins, which in my opinion is much worse than the colectivos that always have change. Is this perhaps the only formalized system in the world that has a more restrictive fare payment system than their informal counterpart? Now let's move on to user experience, which I'm also giving a solid F. This one almost also got an F-, but there's really nothing in this world that is worse than 60-minute headways on a BRT system. The first reason for the F is the tremendous amount of vandalism. The stations are just in terrible condition. Some of the stations have been turned into places to just dump large piles of trash. I saw probably more broken panes of glass in the stations than I saw those that were actually intact. And there's excessive graffiti tagging in almost every station. So as an example, in my opinion, the Plaza Rio station had kind of the average amount of vandalism throughout a station in the system. And you can see the sad state that the station's in compared to the original renderings. To be fair, vandalism is something that happens to even the best stations, and I get that. I even, to an extent, can sometimes sympathize with the causes that drive people to vandalize the stations. But the difference between Tijuana and other systems is that real systems fix the problems fast. SITT, through their social media accounts, has tried to indicate that they're taking this seriously, but reality shows a different picture. Another reason I'm giving the user experience an F is because the system presentation was really just terrible. The website had outdated information about the headways and the station arrival times, both of which were not correct. Many stations confusingly had entrance doors that were closed, presumably to maybe prevent vandalism, which seemed to indicate that the station was closed when they weren't. And in contrary, the main downtown station, which actually was in great shape and had its door opened, seemed like a logical place to board. But after waiting for 30 minutes, the arriving bus diverted down the street right before it turned into the station. And I later learned that the station was actually closed that day, without any notice on their website or signage on the station. And to be fair, I guess, I did later find a Facebook post hidden away, but it did indicate that the diversion would be over by the time that I was at the station, which wasn't true. So if we tally all this up, this leaves the SITT with a 0.95 GPA. Good enough, perhaps, to get into Trump University, but not going to cut it if you are aspiring to be a serious BRT system. SITT really needs to improve those grades, or just get out of the profession completely. Before we discuss the reasons why the system got so bad in the first place, just a quick reminder to please click the like button and consider subscribing if you enjoy deep dive topics on terrible transportation infrastructure in medium-sized cities. Who doesn't? So far on this channel, my 2 deep dive videos have both been on projects in Mexico. Both because, yes, I think Mexico is a fascinating transportation landscape, but also just because it's easy for me to get there. And the Transit World budget, let's be real honest, is quite slim, with even less revenue than SITT brings in. So if you want to see deep dive content in other cities, I certainly for one would love to do that. Let me know in the comments, and also consider financially supporting on Patreon so I can afford a more exotic site visit. So I want to end on a few takeaways and reflections. The system is so bad because it was never actually completed, and I think there are 4 overlapping reasons for that. The first is pressure from incumbent bus operators. Yes, SITT did get 10 concessionaires to sign up to the quote-unquote Company of Companies Pact to help integrate their services and finances into SITT, but they didn't get all of them, especially some key ones that actually work along the trunk route itself. And the system actually experienced some partial closures due to protesting drivers from the informal sector that were not so happy with how SITT was put together. Also, there's been some that have argued, even though 10 people signed up to the pact, there was really only 1 or 2 concessionaires that represented the majority of the power of that pact. And so the rest perhaps just signed letters of intent, but had limited interest in liability in actually making this work. The second reason the system was never fully completed was because of a complete lack of interest from the public. First and foremost, I think the ridership reflects this. In 2016, right before the project opened, they were projecting to have about 40,000 daily riders at first, which would then expand up to 120,000 users after the full build-out. But the reality is just comically different than what they were hoping for in those numbers. They were below expectations for the first 2 years of service, and then ridership completely fell off a cliff. And to be fair, public transit use generally is on the decline in Tijuana, and Tijuana also has one of the highest and fastest growing car ownership rates in Mexico, but this doesn't come close to explaining or excusing the crazy low ridership for SITT. And in addition to low ridership, the public fell out of favor in other ways with this project as well. I already mentioned the vandalism, which isn't just a recent problem. Even back in 2017, right when the system opened, they already had over a dozen stations that were becoming vandalized. There were also a couple of high-profile crimes that took place in and around the stations. And again, SITT here did little to rectify these public opinion issues. And essentially the stations just festered in a dismal state. Third, there was a political administration change that took place at just the wrong time. The system was designed and set up under the administration of Mayor Jorge Astiarazon, and then it opened right after he left office and the next mayor started their tenure in late 2016. SITT had been criticized by PUN as both a boondoggle as well as a project that was subject to excessive corruption and backroom deals. And to be fair, I don't think the new mayor actively worked to destroy the project, but he also didn't prioritize it or give it the love that it needed to take off. And the fourth issue, which is really just a combination of all of the above, is that this project was in financial ruins. They didn't come close to covering their expenses with farebox revenue because, duh, systems pretty much never do. And when this happened, the SITT was not properly funded to make up for the required subsidy, and the Company of Companies coalition was getting cold feet fast since they were supposed to pick up the bill. So essentially what happened was they just decided to run the absolute lowest possible amount of service and keep this thing going as a zombie of what it was supposed to be. So what's next for this system? Well, I think that they pretty much need to paint or get off the ladder, improve it or get rid of it. And it looks like city officials in Tijuana essentially agree with me. In the middle of 2022, they essentially gave an ultimatum to SITT. They said, we're going to now allow general traffic to use the BRT right-of-way, and that would become permanent if SITT didn't get their act together by the end of the year. They also threatened to take away millions of dollars and give it back to the federal government, and they said that ownership likely would move to the state government if SITT couldn't get their act together. So as a result, SITT is now working on a reactivation plan, which, amongst other things, includes an uptick in security, rehabilitation of 18 stations that they've prioritized with the worst vandalism, an astonishing 6-minute headway, and measures to reduce the route time to a little under 50 minutes. So obviously, the future is yet to be written, but at least all I can say for the moment is what exists now provides a cautionary tale. We need to make sure this never happens again, and I think there's a few things that we can do to help ensure that. First, and I think this is very important for everybody, prepare to operate with a subsidy and be okay with that. This is a trap that even the best systems have fallen into throughout the world. It's pretty much impossible to run without a subsidy, so you need to know that, recognize it, and have funding for it before you launch the system. Number two, you got to get all of the existing informal operators on board, or at least the vast majority. To their credit, Tijuana tried to do this, but they just didn't try hard enough, and the process was too full of politics. I think there was a lot of other things that were going on here too that, to be honest, I don't quite understand because I'm not an expert on Baja California politics, but they just missed the mark in this effort to get the existing operators on board. And the third is that the public needs to call out officials when they're being so delinquent on their duties to provide decent service. So that's it. That's all I've got for today. It was a bit of a rant, to be honest, and I'm sure I'll be returning soon to a much more vanilla, less opinionated topic. But I hope you enjoyed this content. If you did, please, if you haven't already, hit the like button, give me a subscribe, and feel free to check me out on Patreon as well. Until next time.